I'd love to just go through some quick intros to who we are, what we do. So Kasper, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, I'm Kasper Spiro. I'm the co-founder of Easygenerator. I'm the Chief Learning Strategist there now. And Easygenerator is an authoring tool for subject matter experts. So it is a very simple authoring tool that allows experts to capture the knowledge and share that in the form of courses or micro-learning with their peers.
And Nelson, yourself?
Yeah, Nelson, one of the founders and the CEO at HowNow. HowNow, we're a learning and skills platform, so we help companies figure out where their skills gaps are, connect people with the relevant learning opportunities that are going to help them close those skills gaps, so they can build the right skills at the right time. Also the author of a book, some of you may have heard of, called Learning at Speed, which brings together kind of mental models and frameworks that companies can use to accelerate the speed at which they learn. And occasionally a guest on Gary's L&D Disrupt podcast.
You two guys, give me the opportunity to shamelessly plug myself. So, but I'll instead defer you back to the chat. There's a nice comment from Carol to say it's an excellent book, Nelson. So some nice feedback there. And then Kasper, you recently published a book as well, didn't you? So
yeah, I forgot about that. So it's also a bit newer than Nelson's one. But yeah, indeed, the idea behind Easygenerator, we call that employee-generated learning. So we basically wrote a book with all the experience we have, the do's, the don'ts, the theories behind it, how to implement it, the whole thing around employee-generated learning. And that is being published. The book is called Employee-Generated Learning, not surprisingly. And indeed, is also out there for sale.
Nice.
You can actually go to Easygenerator website and download a free chapter, so you can sort of check it out if you like it or not.
Ah, cool. Sarah as well ahead of you, Kasper. She's dropped a link in the chat already. So yeah, do check that out. Cool. So I think we're ready to get going. There'll be a few more people that will filter in, but for those of you who don't know me either, my name's Gary here on the team at HowNow, and in my role today is just to help you get the most out of this session by hopefully facilitating a great conversation between Kasper and Nelson, and then taking your questions at the end and putting them to them both. So anytime questions come to you throughout the conversation, drop them in the chat. Don't feel like you need to wait to the end, but we will get to a Q&A later. So as you all know from the title of this webinar, we're talking about creating skills-driven L&D using AI, and in particular, this angle of turning the theory into action. Now, to set some context, I don't know if anyone read the LinkedIn Workplace Learning Report recently, and if you did, maybe just let me know in the chat. But there was this interesting dynamic where upskilling employees was second on the priority list for L&D pros, but the majority of skilling programs in companies were stuck in the planning stage and also the activation stage. So very few had got through to this impact and measurement stage, which makes us look great in terms of how we titled this session, because I think the sticking block is actually how we putting this all into action, how we actually getting these strategies off the ground. So that's a little bit of context there. But I mean, Kasper, maybe kick us off, but why is it so crucial in your eyes that L&D teams, but businesses in general, become skills-based and skills-led in what they do?
Well, that's a big question to start with, but a good one. Well, the first answer is very simple. It is because the value of doing is greater than the value of knowing. So especially in your work in a corporate environment, if you know stuff, that's nice. If you can do stuff, that has impact. So, and we all know that. And there's nothing new here, because if you look at any leading learning theory, it all ends in the final stage is applying, being able to do stuff, skills. Otherwise, there's no impact. So behavior, stuff like that. So, and now, so there is already a trend going on that we go from knowledge-based learning to skills-based learning. And I think that trend is even being, it goes even faster and faster because of AI. What AI actually does at the moment, so if you look, for example, at ChatGPT, it scraped all the knowledge of the whole web in one big AI database, and you can now just ask questions there. So all that information is now available. And there's already software out there that can do the same for your corporate information. So instead of having like a generic ChatGPT, you can get a very company-specific AI database. I think both Nelson and I call it in our books corporate brains. That you have where you can ask any question. So if you imagine that all the knowledge, all the experience of your company is captured in a corporate brain, and if you don't have it yet, it will be there in a few years and maybe even faster because things go really fast. So that means that all the knowledge is always available at the fingertips of people in any language, in spoken language if you want. So it's very, very available. So that means that the value of knowledge-based training is dropping. There is a value, of course, being introduced to content, learning it for the first time, but you don't have to really to memorize it because you can ask it at the system anytime. So where things are moving more and more is that you need to know once you have that information, what are you able to do with it? So it's all about action. So that is really crucial. And that really is interesting because one of the things, well, we talked a bit about my book. One of the things that I is sort of central in that book is a quote from Lewis Platt. He used to be the CEO of HP, and he has a quote which says, "If HP knows what HP knew, if AP knew what AP knows, sorry, we would be 3 times more productive."
Mm.
And it's really interesting because all the information and all the knowledge that you have in your company is available. The problem is it's now in the heads of your employees. But if it actually lands in the corporate brain that we were talking about, that would be immense. It would make you way, way more productive. And it would change the way that we have to educate people and have to school people, have to train people.
Yeah, brilliant. That idea of the value of doing being greater than the value of knowing is brilliant. I love that. So that's brilliant, Kasper. Nelson, from your perspective, why is it so crucial we move to this skills-driven approach in the way we not just approach L&D, but business in general and everything to do with our employees?
Yeah, I think it's skills is what connects learning to performance, right? And I think that's why it's so crucial. It's the bridge between L&D speak and business speak is skills, and it's the language that the entire business understands. And I think this has been a trouble for L&D for a very, very long time, where we talk in a language that only really L&D understand and care about, right? Employees don't care how much content they've completed or how many hours they've spent learning. However, they do care whether they have the skills to get work done, whether they have the skills to be able to progress in their career. The same thing is true for the C-suite, where the C-suite don't care how many courses you have in your content library. They don't care how many hours of learning has been done, but they do care whether the business has enough skills to get work done, to innovate and stay competitive. So that's why skills are so crucial, because it's something that everyone in the organization cares about. And so it forms the foundation for not just the employee experience from kind of recruitment to promotion, etc., but it also forms the foundation for organizational execution, right? It's how we do things. Like if your business has a strategy and it has goals, the first question to ask is, does your business have the skills to execute that strategy and goal? So it forms the foundation for how we think about the things we're going to do within our organization. Now, why it matters more than ever before is it's so damn hard to get the skills that we need, right? That's the problem that we face. There's a huge skills shortage. I mean, there's an interesting statistic I was looking at where 83% of HR leaders say they're struggling to hire for the skills that the business needs. Now, that's a hell of a lot of HR leaders who are struggling to hire, which tells us it's really hard to buy and borrow the skills that we need, and therefore we need to build those skills. And to do that, we need to move towards a more skills-first approach to how we think about learning and development within the organization. The other reason why it's so crucial is it drives the right type of diversity and inclusion. And what I mean by right type is it's not the diversity for diversity's sake. Let's tick a box. We've done a few DE&I initiatives. It's not that kind. It's the right kind, which is looking beyond, did this person go to an Ivy League university or red brick university? It looks past all of those things to fundamentally look at people for the skills they have, right? And that brings about a diversity that's great for organizations, because now those skills gaps that are really competitive to hire for, when you open up your pool of candidates because you now have a more diverse and inclusive approach to thinking about things with skills, it's great. So it's diversity as a strategy that's going to help the business perform better rather than tick box exercise. So for a number of different reasons, it's really fundamental that we adopt this approach.
Yeah. And I think, and leading nicely on to the next question, sometimes the knee-jerk reaction is we need these skills, we have to really rapidly create some content. But Kasper, the problem is, or the challenge is, I guess, that a lot of the content we already have created and that we might continue to create if we don't kind of stop and take stock of how we're doing it, is it's created to be knowledge driven, to your earlier point, as opposed to skills or doing driven.
Yep.
So, tell people a little bit more about what skills driven content should look like.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that. So, because if you have proper skills-driven content, by the way, I rather speak about contextual learning because what you want is people who are able to do a job, and you need more than a skill. You do need a combination of knowledge, talent, skills, your attitude matters, your values, everything. So basically, it's about your competencies. So, but let's say for the ease of use, we stick to skills. If you look at skills-based learning, that is about being able to do. So let's say that you read a great book about how to become a great salesperson. That's great, but then you are not yet a great salesperson. If you memorize all the rules, you have to do it like 1,000 times. You have to fail at it. You have to get feedback. You need to, by experience, learn what works and what doesn't work, and that way you become a great salesperson. So you have to do it. You have to practice it, and that is also what skills-based learning is. So it is not just the content, the rules for sales. It also offers you an environment where you can see the skills. So they bring a demo to you, they're being explained to you by experts, but also an environment where you can practice those skills. So that can be anything from a simulation or a scenario or whatever. So you can sometimes they refer to it as immersive learning. So it sort of immerses you in an environment, and then you have to apply your knowledge, and you have to make choices, and your choices have consequences, and based on that you learn what is right and what is wrong and what works and what doesn't work. So that having said that, it's also the reason why we don't have that much of it, because it's really hard to create good skills-based learning. It's way harder to create like an experience like that where you can practice things than just write some text. So that is the simple reason that the majority of the learning content, and if I talk to a lot of learning managers, and on average when I ask them the question, how much of your learning content is skills-based driven versus knowledge-based, nobody comes higher than 15% knowledge-based learning, and that those are the exceptions. So usually it's less, and all of them know that we need to go there. And I think that's also where technology comes in, because it is really hard to, if you just want to write a scenario and you not even look at the technology of writing a scenario, so all the things that you need to have with the video and everything, but just a script, creating a proper script with a question, a situation where you put somebody in and they have to apply their knowledge, and there is a whole branch scenario where you can go back and forth and whatever. That is so hard. And I believe that is where, for example, AI is already great at. So it can help us if we give us our expertise and present the situation and options. AI can help us out to sort of bring that together into a full scenario, or it can actually later on translate it into a simulation. So I think that is where the technology comes in, and that's also why I think that on one hand AI is driving us towards skill-based learning. On the other hand, it's also part of the solution because it will help us create it.
Interesting. Nelson, from your perspective, that shift away from knowledge-driven content, I can speak from personal experience, because once you're in a kind of rhythm for creating content, it's very difficult to kind of disrupt that and move to something else. So for you, how do we, what are some of those early steps people could take to get away from this knowledge-driven and more to the skills and context-driven?
Yeah, that's a good point, Gary, because I think what's happened is a lot of L&D functions have essentially, there's a bit of a sunk cost fallacy where they've kind of built out this production facility, right? Like, they're almost geared towards, from a structural perspective, to just create as much learning content and that knowledge base, learning content at scale. And therefore it might be a bit daunting to think, well, we've just spent all this money and all of this stuff. Now, how do we pivot this to create more skills-based learning? But like Kasper said, I do think generative AI is going to play a big part in us being able to take the friction out of creating those skills-based learning experiences. But I think even kind of expanding on that, it's thinking about things like a big part, for example, of skills-based learning experiences is feedback. Right, is when you're practicing within this certain environment, it's getting those nudges and real-time feedback that can keep telling you how to improve what you're doing. And there's different ways of doing that. I mean, there's the non-technology way of just having, for example, people use our platform to do a 360 feedback. That kind of keeps giving you that feedback around how you're applying skills in your day-to-day work, and you're getting that feedback from managers and colleagues, and that feedback helps you practice and try things out and improve on what you're doing. But what I'm excited for with where generative AI can come in, I'll give you a few examples of things we're thinking about right now, is, there's a Socratic approach to learning, for example, where back in the day, Socrates, what he would do, he'd have argumentative dialogue with you to challenge your thinking, right? And so it's great for building something like critical thinking, right? Now, that's a learning experience we can quite easily bring to life with generative AI now, right? We can provide the organizational context and essentially simulate that kind of argumentative dialogue that can assess and get you to practice and give you feedback for something like critical thinking. Another way of doing it is often what's really hard with skills-based learning is to assess skills-based learning, right? And that's where you would get someone to observe you doing the job, right? You get a human who's watching you do what you're doing to give you feedback and assess it. And that's, for obvious reasons, quite difficult to scale. But again, generative AI can help us solve that, because we can use generative AI as our eyes and ears to act as the observer now, right? So we don't need a human to observe you doing this thing. We can use generative AI to do that as long as it has the context of what's good and what's bad and what you can improve. And so it allows us to scale that kind of physical or virtual observation. And so I think that's where generative AI is going to play a big part in helping us unlock both the kind of skills-based learning and the assessment and feedback required to really be able to implement that at scale.
Kasper, just to come back to you quickly before we move on, because I imagine you've got some great insights from this, given what you said about Easygenerator being a tool that helps you drive that employee-generated learning. I'm guessing that you are facilitating people to share more of the stuff they've built in practice, and therefore that is transferring to the content that's created, because it's someone who's built the skill teaching someone else who needs to build the skill. Is that fair?
Yeah, correct. So, and simple forms is that allowing people to make a video of a skill and show it. But we are expanding on that as we speak. Indeed, the examples that Nelson gave are really interesting, because you can do those kind of things with AI, and now you can also indeed upload all kind of specific information. So you can give AI the proper context, so it can indeed create an environment like that. And that is really, really crucial. But at the same time, there are still a lot of limitations. So if you do let AI do the full job, very often it sort of goes off track. So what we are sort of experimenting with that, and what we find is that AI is really good in doing things like step by step, and then building it up. But it is extremely powerful, and what is not possible yet in that area will be possible probably in a few months from now, because things are moving so fast, so that will solve itself. So we're not there yet, but indeed it is opening up so fast, and it's really interesting, because we were actually thinking about launching new features, and then they're already out there, and then you think about something else, and then you see something else popping up, and you also hear a company invested like 5 years creating something around AI, and then suddenly it already turns out to be on the market for it. So it's like, it's really crazy how fast things are going at the moment. It's really interesting as well, by the way.
Yeah. 100%. I've just dropped a link in the chat there, Kasper, in case anyone wants to learn a bit more about Easygenerator if they don't already. There's a great question in the chat that we'll come back to, but there's something I wanted to ask both of you first. And Nelson, you can kick us off. But the other part is, we need to move to content that's focused on skills, but there's no point doing that unless we know which skills we need and which skills we have. And that is often, I think, to the point of the data earlier, where people get stuck. How do I measure the skills I need? How do I map what skills are needed, so that I can actually create the content that's going to make a difference, and it doesn't just end up being more content for content's sake? So tell us about how we do that in practice a bit more.
Yeah, I guess going back to what I mentioned earlier, if you imagine you've got a business strategy that you need to execute, or a business goal you're trying to get to, it's a bit like the business strategy is a bit like the recipe. I've just found a great recipe for a Thai green chicken curry that I want to make. And now the question is, what ingredients do I need to make this Thai green curry, right? And you can't make the tiger and curry without the ingredients. And the same is true for you can't execute this particular strategy without knowing what skills you need. And the traditional way of doing it is, you might speak to some of your managers and ask them, what skills do you think we need? What skills do you think each person needs here? Each manager is quite subjective. Every department thinks they're special. I mean, anyone who's gone on this journey will have felt this pain, where every department wants to call their skill in a slightly different way because they think they're special. So it's really, really hard to get them all on the same page. And all of this is quite subjective. And it isn't necessarily benchmarked. You don't know what's emerging. You don't know what skills are going to be less relevant over the next few years. So it's a really tough challenge to solve just by humans to do it manually. And so how we help our customers do this is we essentially help them build a skills ontology, right? So what an ontology is, for those who are not familiar, but it's that relationship between skills, skill hierarchies, skill different clusters in terms of related skills, then how are these skills associated with different job roles? How are these skills associated with different proficiency levels? And the key thing that we talk about in our ontology is tasks, right? There isn't really a relationship between job role and skills directly, but job roles have particular tasks, and those tasks require particular skills for you to be able to execute those tasks. And so what we essentially do, we collect and analyze millions and millions of job market data points to identify what are the job roles that are out there, what are the tasks associated with each of those job roles, and then to use AI to infer what are the skills you need to be able to execute that task. And not just what skill, but what level of proficiency do you need to be able to execute that, right? Because if I'm a project manager, not all of us, not everyone needs to have a level 5 in Agile, right, to do all of our jobs. There's a required proficiency level for that. So we can look at market data, benchmark, and tell you this is what skills someone needs to get these tasks done in your organization. So that's the starting point, right, which is to tell you what ingredients do I need to be able to make this recipe. Now that you know what you need to know what you have. This is when you open your cupboards in your kitchen and go, do I have that ingredient? You check your fridge. It's like that. We're trying to figure out, do we have those ingredients or not? Now, to do that is where skills assessment comes into play. And this is where we help customers assess their skills using the 360 approach that I alluded to before, which is combining self-assessment, peer assessment, and manager assessment to give you an average proficiency level for each of the skills that you have. And that's deliberately designed to be light touch because it can't be a one and done skills assessment. You need them to do it continuously. So once they've done a bit of learning around it, you can then check in to say, well, has their skills proficiency improved as a result of this learning or not? And that's a key part. You need to know what's required and where they are today for you to be able to identify those gaps so you can start to connect them with the relevant skills-based learning opportunities and experiences that can help them bridge those gaps. But without knowing that, it's almost throwing something and seeing what sticks to the wall, right? And that's where often we see traditional L&D teams making the mistake, where year after year, they think the lack of engagement they're getting in L&D is because of content, right? They think the content isn't fun and interactive enough. And therefore, they spend more money in trying to find fun and interactive content. But the problem isn't the content. It's like Kasper said earlier, it's the context. And what gives you the context is skills. Right? Skills gives me the business context because it tells me the business needs these skills, but you don't have these skills right now, or you're unable to achieve your performance goals because you don't have these skills right now. And it's that context that allows me to connect you with relevant learning.
Thanks, Nelson. I'm going to drop a link into the chat. We're going to be doing a session next week where we're showing some of these features around skills mapping and skills measurement on a live product tour or a live product demo, however you want to phrase it. And I'll just drop a link in the chat for that now. Nelson, we were on a great session a week or two ago where someone talked about that tasks approach and some of the first steps you can take. And actually, some of the best advice there was, if you're really early in this, to start with one job task and then map the skills associated to that. If you're struggling to figure out which one to approach first, then think about the ones closest to the customer. So yeah, some good advice there. And if anyone wants me to send over some of that material on that, then you can just drop me a message on LinkedIn. Kasper, back to you. This idea of measuring skills and figuring out which skills you actually need. Anything you wanted to share around this?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of LMSs are working really hard at all kind of tools that sort of give you an insight on your tools gap. And I think that Actually, HowNow is doing a great job there with really smart solutions, getting things off the web, keeping it actual and stuff like that. So, and it's crucial because it's true what Nelson said. So, for example, we have a customer, Unilever, and they are completely moving away from the whole job role idea. They're moving into skills based. So they indeed have tasks, they have projects, and then they're looking for a set of skills to match that. So they are looking at their basically their organization's potential in people in the skills they have, and then they map that skills to the tasks that need to be that they need to be doing. And it's really interesting because skills are very agile by itself. So they are changing faster and faster. So if you have a certain job role, for example, let's say you are a secretary like 20 years ago or now, it's a completely different world with a completely different set of skills, and you need to learn them while you're working. So you need to be able to adjust that all the time. So but the thing is that a lot of time what happens is that there are all kind of tools to sort of get your skills gap, get clarity on your skills gap, and know what you can't do, so what you need to learn. But then a lot of the, let's call them old school LMS, sort of bring you back to the old school learning with just knowledge based courses that do not fulfill the need of skills based training. So having identifying the skills gap, of course, is really important because then you know what to do to solve that gap. But then you also need to have the proper learning, and that's where we fall short very often. So I think that is the challenge we have.
Yeah,
Perfect.
just to add to that as well, to what Kasper said there, Gary, it kind of touches on this idea of the traditional approach to L&D is very content first in the way we talk about it, right? And I saw a question come up in the chat around, is this not using AI to do a training needs analysis? And it's a really good question because actually that's where the problem is. Our outlook on this is when we're content first, for a training needs analysis, what you're doing exactly that. You're trying to understand what training do you need, right? You're already prescribing the solution in what you're trying to find out, right? You're saying you need training, so tell me what training you need, but they might not need training, right? They might not need content. And so it's not about finding out what the content needs are. Actually, what you want to know is what are the skills they need, right? We're asking the wrong question. The question right now the traditional L&D are asking is what content do you need and how can I get this content to you? But actually what we should be asking is what skills do you need and how do I help you build those skills? And that's a very different question. And when you ask that question, you get a very different answer. And actually it helps you be more proactive in addressing the issues. Now, often with learning needs or training needs analysis, it's a lagging indicator. By the time you do your survey and you find out what that means is the problem's been around long enough in the business for someone to self-prescribe that they need this training, right? So you probably missed the boat. The damage is done to quite a degree. Whereas when you're monitoring skills, and that's a different way of thinking about it, rather than a needs analysis, a monitoring and evaluation where you're continuously monitoring skills to identify those gaps are so you can proactively start to address upcoming challenges. Is the way for us to go if we're going to meet the needs of the business at the speed we need to.
Perfect. I'm going to get to some of these questions now, actually, because I have to say thank you, everyone, for leaving these in the chat, but there's some really great ones in there. As the first one, on a similar theme, a couple of people asked this, but we're not necessarily trying to get away from knowledge-based training, are we? It's more that, and it's not one or the other, but what's the relationship between the two? I guess from the tone of the conversation, it feels like actually it's focusing on the skills are needed, and inherently there'll be knowledge associated with that. But when it happens the other way, we think of the knowledge, but not necessarily the skill or the task. But is that fair? Any thoughts on that, the relationship between the two?
Yeah, I think it's indeed both of that. It's very simple because if you need to do something, for example, let's say you are learning to drive a car. So you need to learn the rules of how the traffic works, and you need to have a thing. But you also need skills. So you need to be able to measure the depth between you and the next car. And you need to know how to steer and to shift gear and all that. So it's a combination of the two that you have to bring together. But very often, as we said, we sort of tend to stick just to the rules and not the practical side of things. But in the practical side of things, you use that knowledge. So you can't do skills training without that knowledge training. But it's the value is in the combination, in the context of the two. Then it becomes value. Just having the knowledge by itself is not valuable.
Yeah, brilliant. Nelson, there's a good question here that you might be able to answer, but we're speaking about content a lot, but there's a good question here. Can we define content? Are we talking about, individual resources for people? When we talk about skills-driven content, how do we really define that?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily skills-driven content. I mean, content is kind of used interchangeably for like learning opportunities and learning experiences, right? But like, I think what we're talking about when we say a skills-based learning experience, it could be a project, right? There's a short 1-week project, need you to come and do this. It could be a role play, right? I jump on a call with a manager or a colleague and we role play out things and I'm getting real-time feedback. It could be me recording a demo, me doing a sales presentation, and I get feedback from it. So it's that. I think content is used loosely here, but I think also content probably highlights the problem we have right now, because most people, if you look internally what most of your L&D offering is, in most cases it's probably lots and lots of courses, right? And that's kind of where the problem is, because even in the shape of content, forget skills-based learning experiences, even if we're sticking with knowledge-based learning experiences, we're not providing the diversity that's required, right? You don't need a course for every bit of factual knowledge that I'm trying to learn. A blog might be sufficient, a podcast might be sufficient, a webinar might be sufficient, right? So I think there's still diversity and richness we can bring even in our knowledge-based learning experiences. And just to kind of echo what Kasper said, this 100% isn't an either or situation, right? I think the reason why we've spoken so much about skills-based learning experiences, because it's underrepresented in the learning ecosystems right now within organizations. I think the driving example Kasper gave is a great one. What we right now have a bunch of people who are passing their theory test, but have no idea how to get in a car and drive, right? Which is a huge risk for organizations. So instead, what we're doing is we're going external to hire drivers, right? And you just think that's not sustainable as an organization.
And,
Cool.
and what is really interesting, if you expand on that, because what people often do is that they switch type of content. So they go from written content to video. But an expert reading out the text on a video doesn't add any value. It's just a different format. So you need different information. And if you look at contextual learning, skills-based learning, you have 4 phases, and it's really important to understand that what we are doing with content, formal learning, is just one of those phases, just a small part. So self-paced learning, whatever you call it, it's really great, but it's only the start of the whole learning sequence. So what you very often have is somebody, a coach, a trainer that shows you how to do it and works with you. So in the analogy of the driving lessons, you get a driver instructor that at first will shift your gears for you and slow you take over, and you learn by doing it with him in a safe environment. And with practicing, so it would be even easier if you have a simulation. That would be then an e-learning format of a training where you can offer a safe situation to practice those skills and combine them with that knowledge. And then you go in your car with your instructor. So you have a coach, a mentor. And that is also what happens a lot when people are new in the business. They get e-learning courses to get the knowledge. They get a training session. Then they get a buddy or a mentor or a coach, or they become an apprentice of a master to learn the trade. And then in your final phase, when you're a competent worker, you still need that feedback. So when you're working, you give feedback and you receive feedback from your peers or from the people you work with. That can be customers or whatever. And based on that, you constantly evolve. And those 4 phases. So it is way more than just content. It's always applying those skills, practicing them, improving them, keeping them sharp. So it's not something that stops, and it's an ongoing circle, because when you're done and you think you're competent, things have changed and you have to start all over again. So it is a never-ending story.
Yeah. No, that's so true.
And the other reason why it's not just content is, for example, we have something in HowNow called expert search, where, let's say, for example, you search for something called VLOOKUP. You search for VLOOKUP, right? How do I do a VLOOKUP? That doesn't mean you now send me onto a 10-hour Excel course just to answer that question on VLOOKUP. Instead, what we do with expert search is we would show you who are the internal experts that you have in Excel, right? And so you can now connect with them and learn from them and have a session with them to be able to learn how to do a VLOOKUP as an example, right? Like that doesn't come under your kind of content, let's get learning content paradigm. And so I think it's just thinking about a more diverse learning ecosystem. You know, what are the learning opportunities that can help someone bridge those skills gaps?
Yeah, cool. There's a really interesting thread here. People were discussing this idea of how we measure soft skills. So a really nice chat going on here already, but just to get your thoughts on actually how do we measure soft skills? You know, some ideas around here that it can be difficult, it can be inaccurate. So any advice, you know, especially as we move into this era of being very AI or technology led, especially with those human skills that people need, how can we measure them a bit more effectively?
Yeah,
I think that
I
Nelson.
can kick this off.
Yeah, kick it off. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say some of the examples I gave earlier around how you can use AI, right? You can use AI for observation, AI for kind of practice scenarios and creating that. But there's a couple of different ways you can look at this. Like one is going back to the 360 piece. Now, the reason why the 360, there's two ways you can go about this right now, right? Like you can either do an objective skills assessment, which is where I give you a test, I'll give you an assessment, I see how you perform on that assessment, and then I say, you know what, you're a skill level 4. Now, the problem with that approach is just because you aced an exam, it doesn't make you great at your job, right? Just because you watch the video of someone riding a bike doesn't mean you can get on a bike and ride it. But a 360 assessment is evidence-based. Because when you're combining self-assessment, peer assessment, and manager assessment, the peer assessment and manager assessment, these are people who are evidencing whether they saw you apply that skill within a work context, right? Did they see you get on a bike and actually ride the bike or not, right? And that's where they can evidence and create it. And they also bring in the organizational context of were you able to apply that skill within the organizational context? You know, you might be great at negotiating, but were you great at negotiating a sales deal within our work context? They can bring in that context. So right now, that's probably the quickest way for an organization to start assessing skills in a continuous way with very little friction. Then we can start making inference from performance data, right? Where we can start looking at productivity and performance data. I can look at your sales CRM to see, you know, how quickly you're winning deals, or I can look at your help desk or support desk, how quickly you're resolving issues. And you can start to make inferences using AI on that to say, well, if someone's taking X amount of time and the customer satisfaction score they're getting for the help ticket they solved is X, what does that tell me about their skills proficiency level? And so I think there's a lot we can quite immediately do with data that already exists in the organization, right? And the truth is, many organizations we speak to are not there yet, right? We're still at the 0 to 1 phase. And so I think about taking that first step, right? How do we start assessing and measuring skills without rocking the boat too much? And I think these are ways to do that.
Yeah, and I agree with all that, but there's a big but. And that is that if you talk about assessment of skills, most of the time it's being done from an L&D perspective, so top-down perspective. So we as L&D people are responsible for learning and training an organization. So we need to measure the skills. So we want to have proof that you, Gary, can actually host this session or not before you do it. And that's not how the world works. If I ask anyone at Easygenerator who's responsible for your development, for your personal development and your next step in your career, they will not mention HR or L&D. They will say, well, that's me. It's you who is responsible. And if you look from that perspective to assessment, it becomes really interesting because 360 peer feedback is crucial because it helps me understand what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong, and I can improve on that. But there's no goal for me to sort of get a record that I get like a check mark. I have done this skill. So I believe that learning is turning much more to a bottom-up approach where the employees are responsible for their own development and L&D is facilitating more. And if you look then at assessment and measuring skills, it becomes completely different because you don't want to grade it. You want to improve it. You want to tell people what do they already are sufficient at and where can they improve. So, and that's a really different perspective.
Brilliant. If you want to take part in a live peer assessment now on Kasper's point, you can let me know in the chat if I'm qualified.
I would be interested. Let's rate Gary from 0 to 10.
They're 1 to 5. Let's do it in real time. Cool. We're going to take some more questions, so do keep dropping them in. I'm just going to share a poll now because you would have heard a little bit about HowNow, Easygenerator throughout the session, and the polls popped up now. If you want to learn a bit more about HowNow, Easygenerator, or both, or if you're fine with what you have, you can just answer them. If you want to know about HowNow and Easygenerator, our platforms actually integrate together, so you can create content in Easygenerator and then have it there in HowNow as well. So I'll leave that running. Also, because I don't know how to turn it off on this Demio platform, to be honest. So I'll leave it running, and you can let us know if you're interested. And then someone from our team will get back in touch with you. Cool. I'm going to come back to another one, actually. Question from the chat. It was around how we narrow in on the skills needed. And this was a question I actually wanted to ask both of you, but Nelson touched on a little bit there. But there will be cues around some of the most pressing skills that are needed that you can probably pick up on day to day that are more subtle. So, for example, if people are getting stuck in a particular spot, or if people are struggling with one particular area of performance. So, Kasper, why don't you kick us off? Are there any things people can look out for as they, try and see where skills are needed on a day-to-day basis?
I mean, that you identify the skills gap by yourself?
Yeah, or like, behaviors on a day-to-day basis, the way, people are performing, the ways people are getting stuck in their day-to-day workflow. Is there any way that people can spot kind of quick wins or, pressing needs within the way people perform and act at work?
Yeah, I think that is something that any coach, mentor, or employee would do when he sees somebody working, and because you can respond indeed to incorrect information somebody gives. But most of the time, if you see what kind of feedback people get on their job and on how they perform, it is about what they do. And then very often you go into the mode of, if it's not correct, showing them how you can do it differently or talking about that. But I think it's very often just, I think a lot of the low hanging fruit would be that if you are working together with people, that you have that it's normal to give each other feedback, constructive feedback all the time, because that is where the main value is. I think that is the biggest win that you can have. And sometimes in organizations that's not done because it's perceived that you then would come over as, well, I'm better than you, so I know better. But the interesting thing is it's not even very often become seniors and juniors, and very often the idea is that a senior needs to coach a junior. But if I look at myself, so I'm 61, so I'm typically a digital immigrant. And in Easygenerator, I think the majority of people are around 30 or below that. So they're all digital natives. I can learn so much from them on how to deal with social media and all that kind of stuff. So everybody has things they're really, really good at. And if it's, and I love it when somebody, and I don't care if they're 40 years younger than me, if I do something online which is in their eyes not smart, and they give me feedback, wait a minute, you can do this in a better way. That's how I become better. And if you sort of don't have those boundaries, and if you have the ability to give respectful feedback to anyone, anytime, I think that is like a great thing. That's a big value.
Nice. Nelson, you mentioned a couple of the ones
Yeah.
there, like if a sales rep is potentially struggling with a scenario, then, that's a signal that some other bits there. So anything else you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think I'd probably point towards an overall approach, right? We've spoken a lot today about AI, but in truth, it's not about using AI. You don't start with AI, right? You don't start with any tool or any tech for that matter, right? The tech doesn't come first. The problem does. And, we often talk about love the problem, not the solution. But quite often in L&D, we rush to the solution, right? We already have a solution. I bought a content library with 1 million courses. I need to use this. So I'm trying to find a problem to fit the solution that I already have. And so instead of doing that, what we should be doing is spending more time in problem discovery, right? And that's where a lot of what Kasper touched on in terms of collaborating and speaking to other stakeholders, right? Even now, it's speaking to people in the business where is there a business problem right now? Maybe you're not hitting your sales target, or you're not delivering your product innovations on time. Have you spoken to that team? Have you spoken to the product leader? Have you spoken to the product managers in that particular team? And they might say, yeah, you know what it is, I think they need a product management course. all you need to tell them is, that's fine. Let's put that to the side and dig deeper, right? It's the classic kind of 5 whys. Let's find out, why do you think they need a product management course, right? What's the problem? Where are we seeing it? And that problem discovery, what we need to be doing is, right now we probably spend 20% of our time in problem discovery and 80% of our time in execution of the output mode. Instead, we need to flip that around and spend like 80% of our time really nailing the problem and the metrics that tell us that the problem exists and the metrics that tell us if the problem is solved. And then 20% of the time is really about curating and bringing together the right experiences and then tracking to see whether it's helping us move in the right direction or not.
And that is the interesting thing. If what we see with employees creating learning content. So if subject matter experts create learning content, the perspective is really different. So very often L&D comes from above, and indeed things along the lines that Nelson described. But if you create a course or a micro learning as an expert, because I just discovered that I do something in a way that is really efficient for me, and I see other people not doing that, I just want to share that experience. So I know it's valuable for me, and for that it will probably be valuable for someone else. So I can just, here's the problem, this is my solution for the problem, take it or leave it. And then very often you find that those kind of information are very popular with people and have great value because they come from the practice, they come from the problem itself.
You both touched on something there that links to another question I'd flagged in the chat from Sean, and it's around, you're not knocking AI, but from this discussion, some of these taking away is that we need to train people in how they create that content, because that's a fair point, isn't it? We can't just say we need to create more content around skills and then not enable people to then go and create it. You know, it's kind of like putting the cart before
Correct.
the horse, or however you want to phrase it. We're saying we need more of this, but we're not enabling you with the skills to go and do it. So any advice on there on, you know, actually enabling people to create content that does tick these boxes that we've just discussed?
Yeah, that's actually a great point. So I had a webinar the other week with a professor from a university in America, and we were discussing this. And basically, I sort of blamed her for it, because I said, well, part of the whole problem is how we are taught at school and universities. It is all really formal learning, knowledge driven, not experience driven. So the moment though that you are asking an expert to create learning content, they think along those lines. So you sort of need to break that. So it is a mindset thing. And I think, again, well, we spoke about AI a lot, but what I'm currently making is I'm creating a learning theory, basically instruction design theory for subject matter experts. So basically writing down all the rules to create good content from a subject matter expert point of view. The idea is to put that in an AI database. And with that, we could create like an AI coach, because I'm convinced if we would put in features in Easygenerator that allow you to create skills-based learning, nothing will change, because you need to sort of nudge people towards that. You need to tell them to do it, or maybe even to show them to do it, pick up a piece of the content and put it in a different form and show this is also what you can do. So I think that we need that you really need to push people in that direction, because it is not our mindset. Our initial thought is pouring out the information we have instead of sharing our experience.
Nelson, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, do we need to train people to create content? I think in the long run, we won't need to, because generative AI will do it end to end, right? There'll be multiple AI agents who will do the entire process, and with the best practices baked in, because, you know, somewhere someone will have, you know, Kasper might come up with a very specifically trained model with all of the best practices. And actually, as long as you have an AI agent that's working with that context of that model, it's going to know how to create the best type of skills-driven learning experience. So I don't think necessarily a human needs to learn how to do that. But I think what we can learn from what we've seen of generative AI through ChatGPT, for example, there's a great article I was reading around the fact that although ChatGPT's adoption exploded, its engagement stagnated after a while. And when they dug into the data, the problem was a lot of people, your kind of experience with ChatGPT is only as good as the prompt that you put in. And what came to the forefront was a lot of people are not good at writing good prompts. So actually their experience with ChatGPT wasn't that great. It was quite basic, right? And so what that tells you is if you don't know what to ask for, then you're not going to get something great, right? And so I actually think the thing we need to be trained on or learn, get the skills for, is to know what to ask, right? It's to know what to ask and know what good looks like. And I think that applies to so many different things we're going to have to do in a day-to-day work. So I don't think we necessarily need to train how to do skills-driven learning experience, but we do need to know how to articulate the problem we want, Kasper GPT to solve for us, right? And so I think that's what's really key. And so I think that's a fundamental skill for us to develop.
Yeah. So a lot of agreement around these points in the chat, in terms of how we prompt. I wonder as well if it's just going to be downstream from how we consume content in our everyday life, because only good content that solves problems is being surfaced in algorithms. How many of us are turning to like YouTube Shorts, TikTok videos to learn how to do things? So actually, I wonder if the content we're consuming outside of work being so practical and skills-based, it is going to kind of just change our expectations of work or influence what we create at work as well. So it'd be interesting to know if anyone agrees with that in the chat as well. Cool. We've got 8 minutes left. So if you do have any questions, I don't think I've missed any, drop them in now. I'll ask a quick fire one to you both. But, any advice for, along the point that Kasper made earlier, if people internally have answers to questions, it's about connecting those people together. It's also about capturing that so we don't lose any of that knowledge around the skills to solve problems related specifically to our business before people leave. So just any, I guess, final thoughts on how we enable more of that knowledge sharing and skill sharing and knowledge transfer between employees.
Shall I kick that off, Nelson?
Yeah.
You've written an entire book on it, Kasper, so I think you should, yeah.
That's sort of what Easygenerator does. So I think it's about finding the people, the right people with the right experiences and the right knowledge. And that is a challenge. And I created, so you all probably have heard of the 70-20-10 rule, where 10 is formal learning and 20 is, well, you know the whole thing. That's 90% is informal. I have the 70-20-10 rule for content creation. So a small part of the population of your employees, let's say 10%, is willing to share his knowledge by himself. So that's something they're inclined to do. So they are the ones that will create a course or will take an initiative or stuff like that. So those are the creators. Then you have like a bit bigger group, let's say 20%, and those are basically the followers. So if people ask them, do you want to co-author with me on a course because you know about this or you know about that, then they're fine, they will work along with them, but they will not take the initiative. But the large majority of our population, let's say the 70%, there are the consumers, they are the lurkers. They just want to consume that information and they don't want to share that. They don't have that that's in them. So the trick is, how do you find the experts that are willing to share their knowledge and willing to share their experiences? And there are a couple of simple go-to rules. So if you are an instruction designer, you now interview subject matter experts for creating your courses. So those people, the information they give, you process that and put them in your design, and then you create a course. So work with them in a different way. So for example, create a course with them, ask them to write a topic and coach them and mentor them and guide them and design it for them, but have them write it. So then you already change it, and then they start becoming content creators instead of just a source of content. You have your trainers, the mentors, the experts in your company. That those are the go-to people that you can look out to. And as I earlier said, they don't have to be seniors. Like, it could be a digital immigrant of 20 that can teach an old guy like me on a certain area. And also, when you do it, it's a part of building a learning and knowledge sharing culture. And that is something that doesn't happen overnight. If you don't have that in your company, you can't have it tomorrow. So you need to start small. You need to start creating content. You need to start creating small successes so people can see, wait a minute, that works. And that is valuable for me. And they can maybe get enthusiastic about that. And then they can start doing that self. So you have to build that culture. And you can't do that overnight. So, and really important that is, you have to lead by example. So if you're not talking your talk, walking your walk, and just talking the talk, then it doesn't work. And if you would be able to actually have your C-level sharing their knowledge in that same format, in a course or a training or whatever, or a knowledge sharing session, that is so valuable, because leading by example is something that really, really helps. So all those things together sort of let you to that you can start up with sharing your knowledge, sharing the information, building a group of people that are actually doing that actively and expanding that like an oil stain, and slowly it will expand through your company step by step, and it's the success that will drive it then.
Brilliant. And Nelson, in the last couple of minutes now, so any sort of final thoughts from you on that employee learning
Yeah,
piece?
just like I guess a tactical one on that is to go where it's already happening, right? There's already knowledge sharing and tacit knowledge being shared in your organization. A good example of that is if you're using anything like Slack or Microsoft Teams. Right now, there's so much knowledge sharing and exchange happening, but the problem is all of that knowledge gets lost in the stream of conversation, and so people are stuck having to answer the same question over and over again. You've essentially got what we would call as a leaky bucket, right? People are sharing good stuff on Slack and Teams, and all of that good stuff, goes. And when that person leaves the company, it leaves with them. And so, with HowNow, for example, we've got an app for Slack and Teams where you can capture that knowledge and save it as a nugget and create that organizational memory or that collective brain, which people can then search. So you're building a search first culture where people can search for this knowledge that never gets lost in the organization. And so, yeah, that's an example of trying to go where the habits exist, so it's not as hard to force a new habit and capturing it. I think it's a great start for starting to capture that kind of knowledge.
Cool. Brilliant. So there's no more questions in the chat, which means we did a great job. I get to use that dad joke that I always like to do. But yeah, that means we've answered everything people wanted to know. So I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone. This is one of the most engaged chats that I've seen on a webinar for a long time, and people really engaging with each other, sharing some great tips and advice. So I really like that. I'll drop links to connect with Kasper, Nelson, and myself in the chat as well, if you'd like to do that. And other than that, Nelson, Kasper, thank you for your time and sharing so much great advice.
And thank you for hosting it, Gary. I think you scored a positive mark here.
It's a 5. I'll send out a form after this just to rate me. None of the feedback on the session, just to rate me. No, yeah, really good. Loads of love coming in through the chat now. So yeah, thanks, and we'll do it again soon.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.